You're listening to Conflict Radio on the Conflict Radio Network. Greetings and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is December 28th, 2020, and I hope everybody enjoyed their Christmas holiday or Christmas break. Merry Christmas, everyone. Hanukkah, whatever it is you celebrate. I hope you had a good time of it. Today we're going to be speaking with an MK Ultra survivor. Her name is Anne Diamond. Anne Diamond was born in Montreal, where she is also graduated in history and creative writing at Concordia University. She studied fiction with Raymond Carver in the MFA program at Goddard College in Vermont, and later taught creative writing at Concordia University and Thompson University in Kamloops, British Columbia. My Cold War, a memoir about growing up in secret Cold War experiments, is available on Amazon Kindle. Now, this is our first time talking about MK Ultra, and I'm sure we're going to have a bunch of shows covering this in the future. It's not often that we get to speak with a survivor of something like this, and I think we're in for a wild show. I wouldn't recommend you let children listen to this episode. It's probably a little graphic and will, I guess, cause you to use your imagination a little bit. So let's just get right to it and get to the show. We'll be back with Anne Diamond. We're going to talk about MK Ultra right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. I've got Anne Diamond with us. She is an MK Ultra survivor. How you doing, Anne?
Hi, I'm fine. It's snowing up here in Montreal.
It's snowing? Oh, that's no surprise in Canada.
Right.
First off,
no, I'm glad. I'm glad it's snowing.
How was your Christmas?
Dull. It was the warmest Christmas on record, and it rained all day. It was tropical for up here. It was 14 degrees Celsius, which is around close to 60, I think, Fahrenheit. Anyway,
all right. Well,
it was a washout.
It's an honor to have you on. I want to thank you very much for coming on the show and talking about your experience with us. I was wondering if just for the listeners who don't quite know, if you can just give a basic summary of what MK Ultra is.
All right. Okay. Well, MK Ultra was a military program, which, a huge project with many sub-projects. It was based, well, I think it began really in London after the war, during the war, with a supercomputer that they were building to spy on the Nazis and to decode the Nazi messages and so on. I think it really began there and then began to expand as a mind control program for domestic warfare on populations. Alan Dulles of the CIA was the man who signed it into existence in March of 1953. And I think I have that right, yeah. And yes, and it continued till into the 60s. Officially, I think it was dismantled in 1964. And it operated in cities at institutions around North America, United States and Canada, and there were many. There were, I forget how many. I think it's 168, but I'm not sure. 175 or something sub projects. Those are the ones that they know about, that they were on. That happened on military bases, that happened in hospitals, in schools, universities, and research centers all around North America, also in England, and so that it's a huge topic, to get into. So I was part of one project in Montreal, Canada, at McGill University. As a child, I was enrolled in LSD experiments, which was one of the things that they were doing. They were doing drug research. They were looking at ways of controlling human beings through any technique they could find, including, electricity, electroshock, drugs, hypnosis, voodoo. They would investigate any herbal medicine, African herbal medicine, sensory isolation, starvation. They used people of all ages, all ethnicities, as guinea pigs in a program to enslave human beings for use in future wars or future campaigns to control us, to dominate.
Now
life on Earth.
In Montreal, you guys had a big orphan problem. I guess I was reading up a little bit on this, and the orphans, I guess, that were basically children of unwed mothers were, I guess in the times, if you were an unwed mother who had a child, you were pretty much forced to give up your baby to orphanages, and a lot of these kids were put in mental homes where they studied them, right?
Yes. I didn't mention orphanages, but orphanages were really also one of the sites where these experiments happened. And yes, we have a very kind of famous or notorious thing that happened here in Quebec. They call it the Duplessis orphans scandal, or it started in 1953, really, 6 months after the beginning of the MK Ultra program in March of 53. 6 months later in Quebec, there was this massive moving of orphans from orphanages into mental hospitals where they were used as guinea pigs for the state. The Catholic Church was involved because it ran the orphanages, and they seem to have partnered with doctors, with medical and military scientists who needed human guinea pigs. And these orphans, because they were orphans, nobody wanted them, were declared mentally retarded. Most of them were not, even though they were not given a good education, but they weren't mentally retarded children. But in order to get more money from the federal government, the government in Ottawa would give money for cases of mental retardation. So the church profited, and I guess the institutions profited from this. And then also it left those kids with no rights at all because they were seen as disposable.
Yeah, there are testimonies and witnesses I've read up on this story that show that even a lot of these children they had their organs harvested even.
I think that happened. I've met some of them, and I did some interviews, and I've written on that in my blog, so yes, I know something about that. I have even some film footage of the interviews. One orphan in particular had a story that was completely shocking. His name was Silvio Day. He said he met a Nazi doctor in the hallways of the mental hospital where he was sent as an orphan, where he was around 17, 18, and he was kind of strong, and they had him transporting corpses of little children whose brains had been operated on and removed, and he witnessed dead children with their heads cut open and brains out of their head, taken out of their head, and he would transport them to the room where they froze the bodies prior to burial.
Yeah, and just so everybody knows, this isn't a conspiracy theory or anything. This is absolute fact
Yeah.
it's gone to court, it's been reported on, it's been documented. This did happen. Now, I
Yeah.
wanted to talk to you, I guess, if you could tell us about your experience when you were a child. How old do you think you were when the process started with you?
Um, I, I was 3.5 or almost 4, and how it started for me was I had pneumonia. It was the dead of winter, and I seemed to, had a bad cold, and then it turned into pneumonia. They sent me down to the hospital in an ambulance, and I remember it. I mean, I remember being put in the ambulance, and I remember the driver putting a mask over my face, and it smelled it wasn't oxygen, it was ether. It smelled terrible, it smelled toxic, and I have a very clear memory of trying to pull the mask off, and the ambulance driver jamming it back down on my face and passing out, and then waking up sometime later, days later, in a hospital ward with other children in beds, and my mother coming to see me being very upset. And I remember a nurse being angry with me because I pooed in the bed. And I do have these like childhood memories. I was told about it later that I had pneumonia and that I almost died. And the nurse told my mother that I'd almost died. But my mother found me strapped to the bed. And they said it's because I had been delirious. And I didn't recognize her. So my mother would tell me this story. But subsequently, I've learned that actually what happened was I went in maybe with pneumonia, but I was put in an LSD experiment under the control of Dr. Ewan Cameron, who is one of the really most famous and notorious MK Ultra scientists. He was a psychiatrist at McGill University, originally from Glasgow, or from Scotland, and actually working for the American Air Force. He had American connections, and he had organized crime connections. He had many kinds of connections, and he was the main man in charge of this program at McGill. It was using children. This is when I was 3.5, so it was 1955. Subsequently, I was enlisted in. My parents were told that I had great potential for something or other, and that they were very interested. The scientists were interested in me, and my parents thought it was a wonderful thing. It was presented as a great opportunity, and I was sold basically for $3,000. There's a record even in Washington of Dr. Cameron writing a check that on my 5th birthday in 1956 for $3,000. My birthday is April 11, 1956, and he wrote a check that day. And that kind of allowed my parents to buy a car and a new house because we were living in this tiny apartment. And, my father was a school teacher and didn't make a lot of money, but, so this was a kind of little gift for the family. Yeah. And I became a little test subject and would go to military bases and so on and undergo various kinds of things that they were doing with the kids.
Okay. Well, can you tell us what happened? What kind of, I mean, besides the LSD, what other things did you experience?
Well, you see, the thing about all this, I have to say, it's all behind an amnesia barrier. But I've had throughout my life little snippets and flashbacks, some really horrible flashbacks I've had since I was a kid, like 4 or 5 years old. When I was 4 or 5, I tried to tell my mother that I had been in this underground place with hundreds of other children. We were tied down to what looked like assembly line belts, and we were being electroshocked to our genitals with cattle prods. Well, I didn't say it like that to my mother because I wouldn't have been able to, but I said we were underground where there were witches, and we were tied down to these belts, and they were shocking us, and it was sexual in nature. And So I tried to tell my mother, and she said, well, what would she say? She said, well, that was a bad dream. But I used to go back into that. In my mind, I would return to that dream, that fantasy or whatever it was at the time, every night in order to go to sleep. I couldn't go to sleep without recreating it in my mind, and then I would fall asleep. As a child, I mean, I did that for years. And later in life, and much later in life, when I started realizing I'd been in this program, it was hard to believe because most of it was behind an amnesia wall. But when I was around 50, which is like 20 years ago, I started corresponding with people, and I found like accounts by survivors who described exactly the same scenario: an underground base with an assembly line belt with hundreds of children strapped to the belt and being tortured with cattle prods by doctors and scientists who dressed as witches. And this is written down in a couple of places, and I've been told it happened at China Lake Base in California. I believe I was flown. My father was an Air Force intelligence officer. That's how all this really began. He became a school teacher, taught music in Montreal in high schools. And as I was growing up, I knew that my father was a high school music teacher, but he had an Air Force background, and he was being blackmailed and into giving his children, because I actually had a twin brother who was also in the program, and he was blackmailed and persuaded to give us up into these programs, and I would be flown away. I'd be flown out of my brother remembered going to the airport frequently on Sundays and watching planes take off. And when we were around 3 or 4 or 5 years old, he said, or older, we would go there all the time. He said, well, I have absolutely zero memories of that. He said we would stand behind the fence and watch the planes, and you know, it was a big exciting thing. And no, I have no memory of that. I think I was on the plane. They were taking me to the airport to be flown out, and then they would watch the plane take off. And my brother remembered it very vividly. So it went on through my childhood. I would be taken out of school frequently. I had many absences from school, unexplained absences, on my report cards. You know, where I'd miss 100 days out of 200 in grade 2. And it seems I've been told, I was taken down to the hospital. I had a friend who would also go down. She remembers. I've met people who say they met me as a child at the hospital, and other places, mansions in Montreal. So I think it was part, essentially what I was put into. It was a child trafficking network involving some very high-level people. And I was just a kid that also wandered the halls of this mental hospital and met all kinds of people who were there for a similar reason, but they were much older. And they were part of Dr. Cameron's famous, but also totally top secret now in those days, mind control program. He was creating Manchurian candidates and future entertainers, people who would become important in their fields, often the media, publishing, entertainment, music.
Yeah, now, you know, I wanted to talk about this a little bit too, because it seems like a lot of these kids get programmed to, I guess they're basically under their control, so they can decide who's famous and who's not famous, who's politicians and who's not politicians, based on their level of control, correct?
Absolutely. That's how I think it works. You know, yeah. And they're you know, the adults too were drugged and electroshocked, and you know, they were using techniques that really worked to wipe out memory. So you know, the Manchurian candidate program was that, you know, you'd get someone and you'd use a stun gun. They'd send them on a mission they'd have a photographic memory. They'd memorize a message or whatever. They'd go and kill someone. Sometimes different missions. They'd be carrying drugs or money or weapons, and then they would come back and be hit with a stun gun or a very powerful electroshock, would wipe out, and probably hypnosis also, to wipe out all memory of what they'd just done. It's ongoing. They're still doing that with people. I know of one in Toronto. One guy in Toronto has written a book that happened to him in the last 20 years several times. He, at least.
Yeah. Now, when you were underground with these other kids, I guess on the conveyor belt, was it like a conveyor belt or?
Yeah.
And it would move.
Rubber, I would say rubber and snaking along, rather than kind of in a circular pattern, but sort of a snaking pattern.
Okay, so were you going from one witch scientist to another, say?
Yeah, they were kind of standing
on the belt, like they were standing in one spot, and the kids, different kids would roll by. I'm just trying to get a good visual of.
Yeah, that's what I tried to describe to my mother at the age of 4 or 5.
Now
which I couldn't describe, obviously.
Yeah.
But,
now, were most of the kids quiet or still, or was there a lot of yelling and screaming, or what was that like?
A little of everything. I remember, it's funny. It's funny. I wrote a short story about this in the 1980s, so long before anybody ever talked about MK Ultra, and I had this vivid memory. So I wrote a story about it, and I wrote that my memory then was probably more clear and vivid, but I remembered that the children sometimes screamed, but sometimes they just kind of swooned, and sighed. They were sort of in an altered state, and so there wasn't that much noise. It was almost, you could say, they were excited. But it was painful. But we were being trained to associate pain and pleasure. It was a kind of sadistic, sadomasochistic kind of training that I am sure I received,
So did you see any?
It was sexual.
Did you see any deaths occur, or?
I don't have memory of seeing deaths. It's more like my field of vision, in that situation that I'm describing, was limited because I was strapped down. I have had, all I can say is I've had these sort of a flashback of seeing a kid tortured to death. It's come to me in the last few years. It's just as a sort of, you suddenly have a memory. It comes out of nowhere. You're not thinking about any of this. And I suddenly saw myself in a large group of people, and I think it was in Montreal, and a child was being basically, murdered, horribly murdered in front of us, and we sort of stood there, but there were quite a few people present.
Was it a bright room or was it a dark room?
I would say it was dark with light on the torture, focused on the torture.
Was there any chanting or music at all?
I can't remember that. I just, it came as a flash, and more like the horror of having witnessed that and what that would have done, because I was aware of what it could do to your mind to witness to something like that, and how you might just completely wipe it. You might blank it out and never be able to access it.
Now, did
they keep a lot of witnessed it?
Did they keep a lot of kids in cages? Were you ever in a cage?
I heard from other people that they did. I have a friend who has very vivid memories of that same time, and so this is the 50s, late 50s in Montreal, and a famous doctor who she knew, and she knew the family of the doctor also, and so she can name names and so on. And the doctor had children in cages in a certain wing of this neurological hospital, which was part of McGill. And those children were experimented on, and sometimes they would be murdered. They'd be killed as examples for different purposes. But in one case, she was taken into a room and threatened and told to keep her mouth shut about everything. She was 8 years old, and she was leaving. She'd been there for a year or 6 months or something, and she was about to leave, and so they were telling her, you must never speak of what you've seen and experienced here, because the fate of the free world depends on your silence. And she was told that by the famous neurologist. And then what they did was they sent a nurse into her room. She had a little room in the, I don't know, kind of dormitory or a little room in the hospital. And the nurse came in at night and said, "Why are you so upset, dear? Please tell me what's on your mind." And so she poured out her heart to the nurse. And the next day she was taken into the office of the doctor, and he had a little child there with him, and he said, if you ever speak again, this is what's going to happen to you. And he killed the child right in front of her. And she blanked out the memory, all of the memories until she was around 50, just like me. And then they started flooding back. Meanwhile, she'd had a career in the media.
Yeah.
Journalism.
Have you tried?
She was given a career. Yeah.
Have you tried
What?
hypnotherapy to, like, hypno-regression or anything like that?
I've had some of that, but I've had some for at other times, not often. I'm quite hypnotizable, it turned out. But I was taken into past lives, and I've never tried to be hypnotized over this situation, which is big, I guess, omission. Mm-hmm. But I was warned by several people not to do it, because these people, and I met some people who had suddenly been flooded with memories. They said you have effective barriers that are allowing you to function. I do function as a normal person, a little bit neurotic, but I'm. And I've had a career, and I had a career in journalism, and I can think and function and talk and interact and all those things. But if you're flooded with these memories, you can become completely disabled, unable to do anything but lie there and watch the videos of your memories. Horrible, horrible things you've repressed. And I was warned by several people who had experience of that, either their wife or themselves, and they had to spend the rest of their lives on medication. And this was back in the early 2000s. So I decided not to.
Yeah.
But what I did have happen was I had a group of psychics. This bothers some people, but they found me. I didn't really go looking for them, and they kind of grouped around me early on, after I'd already done about a year of research, and they began channeling scenes from McGill from the 1950s. And this was, people wouldn't believe it, but anyway, this was with absolutely no prompting on my part. I didn't orient. I didn't say anything to them. They just began. I didn't say I'm looking to find out what happened at McGill in 1956 when I think I was part of this program. Nothing. I just sat there saying I have a problem or something. Yeah. And it went on for months, in fact, over years. I would go back, and they would give me more information. They would give me absolutely accurate, detailed names, dates, and I could then go, and then what I would do, I would go and look up those names and those facts, and then I would always find confirmation of it.
So besides that underground, I mean, we've got a pretty good visual of that in our mind. Could you give us another visual, another example of what you went through?
Yeah, I have photographs, in fact, of myself and my brother, 1955, 56, maybe even earlier, 1954 even, as little kids, dressed up in, little coats and hats, and kind of obviously dressed up more than we would usually be dressed. And our parents are sometimes in the photos, and and then there's also they're photographing us, and we're in some empty field all the time. And on the hood of the car, 1955 or 54 Ford Consul, a car that was available only in Canada, that my father drove. I can see, as I look at this photograph, I see the license plate. I see me dressed as a little girl about 4 or 5 years old. I see also reflections. I can see a flag. I can see a low building. the environment around the car is like scrub, like it looks like spring. The snow has just melted, and it's everything's just hasn't really started to come back, and it's cold. And on the hood of the car that I'm standing on, there's reflections of what look like, I would say, military buildings. And I have a contact named, I don't know if I should give his name, Stephen. Anyway, I can give you his name, but he has videographic recall. He has written to me and told me he knows what happened that one of those visits. It was a very windy day. Well, one of the photographs shows this very windy day, and I'm holding on to my hat. And he says, I remember you arriving in your Ford Consul with your family, and my father got out to take a picture of your car because they were from Massachusetts, and you didn't have that brand, that make of Ford in the States. And so his dad was a car freak and wanted to take a Ford man and wanted to take a picture. So he says, I remember you got out of the car, you had your little puppy, you were with your brother, and your hat blew off. And you ran to chase your hat. And that's when they took the puppy away from you, and you cried. And then he said, then we went into the facility where apparently I would sit at a desk and with my head on the desk while the other, and various things were going on. I don't know. Some violent things happened around. That's why I would cry a lot. And the children were being, I think, probably trained in different. It was one of the places where they trained the children in things like photographic memory, also ESP, and combat. And so they had kids fighting with one another, sometimes very serious fighting. So this man, who was a boy then, remembers that he was so angry that he had a pencil in his hand. We were drawing or filling out something, and he took the pencil and drove it into the hand of the scientist who was harassing him. He had his hand on the desk, and Stephen took his pencil and just drove it right into the guy's hand. That sort of thing was, And my parents would leave us there. And I think at one point it was me and my brother, and then it became just me. And they would drive away for the day and come back, and we'd be asleep. And they'd take us home, sleeping in the car, because we'd be drugged.
Yeah. And
go back home, and no memory that any of it had happened. And my parents trusted that all this was for for their national interest and our future, to ensure us a good future.
It's almost kind of, it's shocking to hear these stories. Actually, I'm sorry that you had to go through this. Were you able to talk to your parents when you were an adult about this later?
Absolutely not. Unfortunately, I mean, my parents were older than most parents. They had kids. My dad was 50 when we were born.
Yeah. And
my mother was 37 or something. They were older, and they didn't expect to have kids. Suddenly they had twins after 7 years of marriage. Where they didn't think they would have kids. Suddenly they had twins. And then as we grew up, our house was pretty silent. And we didn't talk, and there's no way that any of those things could be talked about. So as my mother died, I was 30. My father died when I was 23. I was way too young. I didn't begin to even have an inkling of this stuff until I was 50, which was in 2000.
Yeah.
2001. And in 2001, I started asking questions about what happened to my father, because the main event that I did remember relating to this program, was that my father was put in the mental hospital for 6 weeks, taken from work, incarcerated basically. We weren't told why.
And how
we were
old
told
were
he
you
had
when
a
that
breakdown.
happened?
What?
How old were you when that happened?
My brother and I were 11. It was in
Okay.
1962, and it was immediately after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And right after that crisis, which had everyone in such a state of panic and anxiety, and then they just early December. So that Yeah, well, that ended in the end of October 1962. Then in early December, my father was taken from work and placed in this mental hospital at McGill, behind McGill, and kept there. We weren't told anything. Well, I don't know. I was a kid. I wasn't told much.
Yeah.
But just that he'd had a nervous breakdown at work and had to be taken there. And they were drugging him and shocking him. And when he came home 6 weeks later, which was a fairly short period of being in there, it wasn't enough time to completely wipe his memory. But he didn't recognize us when he came in the door. We had to sort of say, Dad, yeah, I'm Anne, this is Sandy,
Yeah.
So kind of like, we're your kids, we miss you, we love you. And then he went to bed, and then slowly he went back to teaching. And he finished that year teaching and took early retirement in 1963, June, just at the same time that Dr. Cameron was starting to get in trouble. Huh. And then Kennedy's assassination happened in the following November. And that's when Cameron, I have read, was investigated because there were rumors, it was known that he had been treating Lee Harvey Oswald. That Oswald had come to Montreal and to see Dr. Cameron and maybe had spent time in the hospital there.
Well, that's surprising.
And so there,
So you think Lee Harvey Oswald might have been programmed?
The rumors say that he was a Cameron patient or subject, that Cameron had something to do with him. Cameron would travel all over the U.S. too. He would go. And I did research on him. He would travel with a gun and a portable electroshock machine in his suitcase. He'd carry a handgun, and he'd go to conferences. And he was seen it's known that he was in a lot of places, programming people. So why not Oswald? Well, especially, but I have heard, I'm not sure the book, I think it was Gordon Thomas, but he wrote a book called Journey into Madness, and he really goes into the story of the Allen Memorial. And I think he just said that's where I read, that the CIA came running up to Montreal soon after Kennedy was shot, and they started and they found Cameron had all these people in his laboratories, these in football helmets with speakers in the helmets, programming them with repeated commands, like hundreds of times, thousands of times they would hear the same message. And they were drugged, they were on LSD, they were sensory deprivation, different scenarios. The CIA came into his lab, saw all this, and said, "You're finished. You're not going to continue doing this." And he was getting their money to do it.
Yeah.
And he was funded by the CIA. Allen Dulles being the head of the CIA who set up the program at McGill too. So I'm talking about Montreal. It was, if you go into the history of MK Ultra, usually Montreal comes up. It's considered to be the worst case ever.
Yeah,
the most
but
people.
they were all over. It wasn't just that location.
But they were everywhere. They were at Cornell. They were at Harvard. What is it? Cornell, Columbia, Stanford. All over the Oklahoma. Tulane University, Louisiana.
Yeah.
Vanderbilt. Just so many places.
Well, Montreal was different because they had access to all those orphan children.
I think Montreal offered them something they couldn't find in the States, which was, a population of human guinea pigs. And many of them were children.
Yeah.
And the church was selling them.
Yeah, big shocker, right? The church making money off of child trafficking.
Yeah, it's a big story now, an international story.
Do you think that that's still going on today?
Not in the same way.
Yeah.
But I can give you a scenario of what's happening in Toronto,
Okay.
from my contact there. I don't think it's happening in the same way because I think they were using very crude methods and they would use anything they could, but they found that the best solution was the drugs. In the late 50s, early 60s, they switched to mostly a drug program. Before that, they'd tried, electroshock and different kinds of, and the repeated messages and all those things. They were very crude, experiments. And then they just fastened on the drugs. So at the same time, about 1959, they moved the program to Toronto. Most people don't know this, and how do I know it? I know because I went to Toronto that summer and I was in a program there. But it's York University in Toronto was just opening that year, in 1960, and I personally believe that they dismantled Cameron's program in Quebec, where, believe it or not, the government was onto him and they didn't want him doing the things he was doing, even though the Catholic Church was, all involved in this whole thing. There were politicians in Quebec, there were liberals that were progressives and so on, like Trudeau and his friends at the time, and they helped get Cameron out. And he went to where he was more welcome. Well, his program went to Ontario, Toronto, and so it seems to me from research about conversations, people that I've interviewed and so on, that they started programming the kids later in Toronto. And you have a later generation there, and there were different ways they did that, but it was tied to media and politics, care homes for children, and so I have a friend he's in his 50s. He was the Manchurian candidate. His father was connected to the sociology department of York University. They would live around Canada on Indian reserves and so on. He grew up in this kind of disorienting environment of living off near reserves. His father was an archaeologist, anthropologist. He would study native tribes and so on. They lived out in British Columbia, and this guy was sometimes taken and programmed, and he grew in. By the time he was in his 30s, 40s, he's a programmed assassin, and he'd be walking home from work in Toronto, and there would be a van on the street, and some guy would jump out of the van and drag him into the van, and they'd inject him, and then they would use strobes and different kinds of, electroshock and different things, and they'd put him in this altered state, and then they would take him somewhere in the States where he committed a murder, and take him home to Canada, put him at home. He'd have no memory of it, except that he was very adept at, I think he'd studied hypnosis or something, so he became adept. At some point, he began to recover these memories, in any case, and he began, when he was in the process of being programmed in the van, torture basically used on him, and the RCMP was there, and a police agent also, and it was a cross-border operation with an American military person also in the van torturing him, and so it was a joint operation of the Canadian and the American secret forces, and he became good at forcing himself to remember what was happening. He developed a method anyway so that he could bring back later, get some recall. It might take months, then he wrote a book with extremely detailed description of what was done to him, and he's done numerous interviews, by the way, around the States, and I can connect you maybe to some of those podcasts that he's done. So I think they're doing that in Toronto, where there's a huge amount of violence in Toronto, and there's constant reports of these bizarre stabbings where someone just goes berserk. A woman goes berserk and stabs another woman. That doesn't happen here in Montreal anymore. It's as though they've moved, and and I know through my network that some of those stabbings are mind control victims, that usually they shut down the court case So that when the person starts saying in court, well, I'm being mind controlled, I'm receiving messages and voices are telling me, we're telling me to do this, then they shut down the court case and the person's declared guilty and they, and we've had also that beheading, the bus beheading, years ago. The guy was absolutely under mind control. I mean, if you looked into the story at all, you could see the same people behind him.
Yeah,
so,
it's fascinating because you hear mind control come up in a lot of I guess violent cases that present themselves to the world, and then it quickly goes away. It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And they start to rewrite the news stories, I noticed, because if you get the news stories early on, there'll be details in the story that point to it. And then if you go back to those stories a week later, you see they've been sanitized.
So do you think this stuff's still going? I mean, as far as like I guess it's got to still be going on. I mean, it has to be.
Oh, why would they give it up? I mean,
Yeah.
it's also become the basis of a whole entertainment, industry. So people think of it as fun almost. They like Stranger Things or, the Bourne Identity and the various, series that are based around mind control. But I just want to add, when I was 14, I and my gang of girls in high school were absolutely addicted to The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And I mean, addicted, and watched it every week and just memorized it. And looking back, I now see, I mean, you can look at The Man from U.N.C.L.E. 1964, it was being written by people who obviously knew about the MK Ultra program, and they had scenarios in there. Absolutely. Probably these people, had contacts in the military who were informing them. One of the writers was Robert Towne, a famous American screenwriter, and he was writing scripts for The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which we were, as teenage girls especially, absolutely like devouring these programs, and they were telling us about mind control. I almost suspect they were programming us through that series.
Yeah,
it's funny, but I think this is, it's been going on for many years.
It's kind of like, I guess, Project Mockingbird, if you've ever heard of that, with the...
Oh, for sure.
The CIA runs Hollywood, and all the television programs that we watch are pretty much designed to shift our consciousness into their way of thinking, right?
Yeah, I can't watch TV, really. And I've been that way for most of my life. And I don't go to Hollywood movies, and I just stopped a long time ago. But if I do go, I'm sort of shocked by it's not even at a conscious level that I'm shocked. It's kind of, the audiences are constantly being shocked. And it's to put you in the trauma state where you can then be programmed with subliminal messages. And that's what they're doing, as far as I can tell.
And all of the actors, most of the actors and actresses that are in these shows that become famous are probably kids, were once kids that have gone through this program, because they'll make you famous, but they want control over you.
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
You can't be famous and not say what they want you to say or do what they want you to do.
Oh yeah, like people like Macaulay Culkin or Angelina Jolie, or I don't know. All of them, as far as I am concerned. I mean, they're great actors. They've really got acting down beautifully. They can act, but they're puppets also.
Yeah.
And I think they're involved in cults. I believe those stories about the murderous cults and.
Now, when you were a kid, were they that brings up a whole nother line of questioning that's just curious. Did they ever take blood from you? Were they taking a lot of blood samples or blood from you at that?
I don't remember that. I think very likely they did, but I have no memory of that. As I said, I had these flashes. I remember, I remember being on a table like about 5 years old, and being on a table in a hospital surrounded. I had a clear flashback to that, surrounded by doctors in white coats, and they're talking, and I hear their conversation. This came to me as a real flashback. I mean, I hear their conversation, and they're discussing the procedure they're about to do on me, and they do an electroshock to my heart, massive electroshock to the heart, and then they sort of stand and talk, and then they say, well, okay, this is a very dangerous. If we do this again, we could kill this child, and then they do it again. Or and I sort of leap off the table. I mean, I was in bed, and I literally like flew up off the mattress. I kind of jumped from, my body left the mattress.
Yeah.
And when I had the memory, so I don't remember blood. I remember blood on the floor. Somebody's blood was spilled. I have a flashback. I've had a flashback to that, but in a game, with children.
Yeah.
At McGill, it's
so
basically. I mean, yeah. Okay.
You had an interesting neighbor as well growing up. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I had a long. I'm calling it a friendship. I mean, which is really what it was, although it was a bit problematic or peculiar as friendships go. But it was with Leonard Cohen, the singer, songwriter, poet, Canadian.
Yeah. Right.
He started off as a writer and then went into music. So he was my next door neighbor in Montreal. He was my neighbor for many years, but I moved. I moved in 2 or 3 different apartments in that neighborhood, and so I was always kind of near him. I met him for the first time kind of as an adult in 1977 at the age of 26, and he was 43. He got my phone number and called me up one night and invited me over, and that's when I had my first kind of conscious encounter with him. And that was 1977, so then I knew I was kind of friends with him until about 1990, and then we kind of fell out about 1990 when he literally seemed to be trying to recruit me into he wanted me to convert to Judaism and kind of be part of a sort of a secret, would seem like a secretive group that was not a group that I would ever want to be part of, that basically had a plan for world domination and mass murder. I mean, he really said that to me one night in a restaurant. It kind of implied that, I could be part of this. And that was it. I said, I can't know this person anymore. He's too crazy, and I think he believes this, So he was a 33rd-degree Mason. I didn't know all this, but I've learned it since. And a CIA agent, and he was many things. He was also programmed with me at the hospital in Montreal, but I was a little girl, and he was like a 20-year-old young man.
So he was going through the programming.
Yeah, and I mean, I know this in retrospect because I can't really say I remember seeing him. I don't remember what happened very much when I was 5, But he spoke to me in such a way when I did meet him later that suggested he had known me as a child. Like he would call me Wee Annie, it's Wee Annie. Well, I was like 6'1", and he was like 5'7" or 5'8", Yeah. But he called me Wee Annie, and he sang songs. When I first met him, he sang some songs that went back to those cowboy songs that went back to those days that I think of when he was in the hospital. You learn things through research too. So I learned, and I've met people who said, they saw him at that hospital. And I even have a friend who's a teacher who had a student whose mother, was a nurse and was the nurse that used to take Leonard into the electroshock room. And she says, yes, he came frequently for electroshock to the McGill hospital called the Allen Memorial. That's what it was called. And he was frequently there. But I've heard it from many people, and he told me in 1990, or a little bit later, I saw him a bit later, he called me one time. What was that? It must have been it was the early 90s. He was taking Prozac, And it was experimental at that point. So he said, I'm on this new experimental antidepressant, and I'm just having a terrible episode here, and it's been like this for days, and I can't go out, and I need you to shop and buy me some food. So I went out and shopped for him and brought him a bag of groceries. And he said he couldn't get off the couch. He said, I can't get across the room. I can't walk across the room. I can't get from 1 minute to the next. He said, I'm so, and I said, why? What's wrong? I mean, what have you done wrong here? Why don't you get some therapy? He said, oh no, therapy can't help me. He said, the only thing that can help me are those doctors at the Allen Memorial and the drugs. They're the only people. And he was obviously a mess.
Yeah.
And he slowly got over it. He gave many interviews later, and he would use that same phrase. He'd say, I couldn't get from 1 minute to the next, or 1 second to the next.
Huh.
And then he later claimed that the drugs never, the Prozac, et cetera, never helped him really, but it almost made him worse. But now they say that at the age he was at that point, which would have been like 55 or something, late 50s maybe, when I saw him that day, and he was such a wreck, it's very possible it was his programming that was disintegrating, because that will happen at that age, after having been through that Manchurian Candidate, like psychic driving, whatever they called it, brainwashing. It doesn't last forever. After about 20, 30 years, it'll start coming to pieces, and the person goes to pieces.
Yeah. So has that ever happened to you?
I think, yes, but let me think now. I know when I was 30, and that was the age when I was around Leonard a lot, and I was on an island in Greece and spent the year there, and he was there that year. I'm not saying I had a schizophrenic breakdown. I was writing a novel because I had a grant from the Canadian government to fund artists, and I had a grant, and I was writing this novel, and I was having what seemed to be flashbacks to earlier lifetimes, and different things were happening to me, and it made me pretty, and I cut all my hair off, mm-hmm. And I was living in this cold room, and I think from the outside it might have looked like I was having some kind of real long-term kind of breakdown. I'd changed, and I was having these very vivid, almost like photographic, videographic dreams. Not that much, but a bit. And if I talked about that, I sounded crazy, And that 30 is the year, they say, for the women who've been part of this monarch, they called it MK Ultra monarch slave programming, which I think I was. 30 is the year where they kill them usually. They can kill these women. They will just say, okay, you're done. You're 30. You're not so attractive anymore. You're not much use as a sex slave. I'm not sure that I was used as a sex slave. By the way, I don't have any memory of that, but I think it's possible. But they will then say, okay, you're done, and they'll kill them. And I had briefly suicidal feelings, not impulses. I would just say thoughts. Mm-hmm. That year, and I would say it's the closest I ever came to feeling like my life isn't worth, living anymore, but not for very long, and I pulled myself out of it. I think I was touching that, crisis that they say happens to those programmed women at the age of 30. It's a crucial year. And then they throw them from the freedom train. Have you ever heard that? If you get into the literature of MK Ultra, at age 30, there's a command to throw them from the freedom train. Is what they call it?
Okay. Well, what is that?
And it's basically, I guess, it's either suicide. They will feel like throwing themselves off a bridge or a cliff or something. I was living right near a cliff. I could have done it, but I didn't. They're just or they might just come and kill you, but you'll be thrown from the train.
So what became of your brother? He was part of this along with you, right?
Yeah, my brother, I think, was eliminated early on. Um, his he was unwilling to talk to me. He had trouble believing some of the things that I was. I wrote a whole book about this, and he tried to read it, or I think he read it. Um, what my memory is that when he was 4, he had an accident and had a cut over his eyebrow, and had to wear, and then also was diagnosed with a lazy eye. His eye would float around, one of his eyes, so he had to wear glasses. And I think that is the point where they decided he wasn't fit for the program. He wasn't strong enough. And I was taller. I had a different genetics. We were twins, but we looked quite different. He was smaller than I was. And we were obviously our children, the parents of our children, the children of our parents. Excuse me.
Yeah.
We resembled our parents, but my mother was very tall for a woman. My father was, just about her height. He was tall, but not that tall. My mother was extremely tall for a woman, so I took after my mother in height, and my brother was a little smaller. So I think they just chose me. They said, "Well, she's the one we're going to work with."
How old were you when they stopped with you?
It's hard to. That's a story in itself. But I think my father, when we were 11, but especially with me, this affected me much more. I think my brother was already out of it. He was not being programmed. He wasn't being taken out of school, for example, and taken downtown and whatever, all that kind of stuff. That never happened to him. But when I was 11, that's when they put my father in the mental hospital. And then I suspect, based on memories I have before and after, that he was resisting. He had found out that what was happening to me was actually sexual in nature. I was being sexually abused. He had learned that, and he was he was shocked by that. He wanted me out. So I think his resistance is what likely the cause of them putting him in the hospital. Him telling them, "I want my daughter out."
Yeah.
So I feel that around 11 and 12 is when it kind of, as a family, we exited. But that doesn't mean we wouldn't be accessed in different ways later. So I think it continued, but my father was forced to take early retirement. Our lives changed. My mother got very sick. It was we were under attack in different ways. I would have LSD type hallucinations at night, a voice talking in my head, saying exactly the same message to me that I have read was one of the messages being delivered to the patients down at the hospital, which was, I would hear hundreds of times in my head at night, "You're no good, you will fail, you will never succeed at anything." So as I put it together now, and I remember these incidents, that I didn't talk about. I never told my parents. I would have these hallucinations that would go with that voice, just like getting off on LSD, where you get big, small, things get loud, they get soft, the clock speeds up, the clock slows down, and then I'd hear this voice. So somehow or other, electronically or somehow, and I think I was being drugged at night and programmed. And as I put it together, it looks like we had fallen out of favor, and they weren't encouraging me anymore. They were telling me I was finished.
Yeah. That maybe they were trying to get you to, off yourself, right?
Yeah. I mean, I remember writing even in June, like I was 12 and it was June, it was the history exam at school, and I wrote the whole history exam of the voice in my head going, "You're no good, you will fail, you will never succeed at anything." Constant going on. I don't know why, but I was hearing it. And but I aced the exam. I did well. And after that I said, "I'm free of this." And it never came back. That particular, voice never came back.
Yeah. Do you hear anything now? Or
No, I'm not a voice. I don't hallucinate. I'm pretty, compared to some people, You used to know. I don't hallucinate. I don't go off, and I don't have psychotic breaks. I don't hear voices. I used to dream vividly, but I can't really say that the dreams were bad. They were or malignant or a hallucinatory. They were more like I would be given information in dreams, and that still happens. I think I have some psychic abilities also that they were interested in that are just innate, natural abilities.
So whatever happened to Leonard Cohen?
Well, what happened? Well, a lot of things happened. I don't know where to begin. After that time in the early 90s when I saw him, he pulled himself together. He was on drugs a lot. He was also involved in a Buddhist Zen Buddhist monastery in California at Mount Baldy, where he moved there. He was giving a lot of interviews, and he continued to make music, put out albums. He lived in LA most of the time, but he would come to Montreal, where his house was right next door to where I had an apartment. We shared a backyard almost.
Yeah.
And so I would see him, on the street and so on. But he would come occasionally to Montreal. He mostly lived in LA, where his children lived, and the monastery was there, and his teacher and all that, and his music career.
So you think he was able to overcome the need for the program?
I think what happens to people, the need, I think they come to terms with it. You see, I stopped talking to him about 1995. Basically, that's where there was just a complete break. And so if I had continued on to knowing him, I would have talked with him about it after 2000. But he told his agent, who I am in contact with, and her mother, more than once he told them he had been part of the MK Ultra program at McGill. She has written to me and told me that. And he said, and most people don't know about this, but I was in it, and it's getting to be better known now, because in the 2000s it really became one of the conspiracy topics of the internet, one of the biggest conspiracy topics, and suddenly everybody was hearing about it. So he then told his agent, by the way, I was part of that, Yeah. I think he was programmed not just at McGill, but also at Columbia, and possibly Cornell. I think he moved around, in the 50s and 60s, I think he, like Joan Baez, and whose professor father was at Cornell, or Allen Ginsberg was at Columbia, and was hospitalized at Columbia in the Institute of Psychiatry there, and the same psychiatrists that they would come up to McGill and work with the doctors that programmed me and Leonard.
So what do you think?
All this.
What do you think it was he was talking about when he was talking about, they're going to take over the world, and I can get you into this group?
I think he was talking about a group of Jewish, I don't know what to call them, Satanists, basically. You may have, they're Sabotage Zavi. Have you ever heard of him? I had known many years earlier, I knew that Leonard had this sense of connection with a false messiah of the 17th century who died in 1666, or who was imprisoned in 1666 in Europe, and he had millions of thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of followers, and he was like a messiah, but he was a false messiah, and his movement, collapsed. But many people lost everything because they followed him. And I know that Leonard had a book on him and talked to me about him and told me, he felt like he was the reincarnation and different things, back in the 80s, and I was reading about this false messiah, Sabotage Zavi. So then I only fairly recently, or in the last 20 years, I've found out that there's still these followers of that, and they still exist, and they are secret societies. They're kind of like Jewish Freemasons, and And they've in some based in Frankfurt. Some of it is based in Frankfurt, Germany, and some of it, New York and different places, Turkey, and they are probably involved in some satanic activities and a lot of world controlling, because the Rothschilds, you could say, would be part of that.
Yeah.
So, and Leonard was close to the Rothschilds. So, yeah.
There's a lot of rumors of things that happened on, I guess, Epstein Island. Would that be kind of the same same group he was talking
the
about?
same people, I would say. The Bronfman sisters, you wouldn't maybe know about the Bronfmans so much, but they were a big Montreal family. I believe they funded Dr. Cameron, I think I can say I know they did. And they introduced him to organized crime elements that helped him he was a criminal and a hero of psychiatry and a worldwide, figure of the, a champion, whatever, hero of medicine, but he was also had his feet in mafia. So
yeah,
they funded him, So yeah, all those the connections are just really obvious when you research it. And I think being in Montreal I think it was a good place to research it because I know some of these people. Some of them are my bosses and newspaper editors. People are working for these people, for these gangs. They've even tied it to the Kennedy assassination. You want to just get into that? That there's the gang that Leonard grew up on the same street with, the Jewish mafia, a circle of Jewish mafia families have been, according to one, researcher, closely tied in with the Kennedy assassination. It's another topic.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think that? What do you think personally? Do you think that the JFK assassination was planned by the MK Ultra people? Do you think that they did that on purpose?
I do, but I'm not researching things very much these days. I have a kind of enough of a general sense of it. Having done a lot not so much recently, but yes, Alan Dulles hated Kennedy, and Kennedy was going to fire Dulles, and Dulles was the Mr. MK Ultra, and he had access to an army of Manchurian candidates. He had and he was funding Dr. Cameron, and Dr. Cameron, apparently or allegedly, was programming Oswald, who I don't think killed Kennedy, but I think he was involved in the operation. I personally think Oswald was trying to save Kennedy, but who knows, And the other people in the CIA killed him, and the Cuban, mafia and all that.
Yeah.
But everybody's got their theories, and I'm not in any way an expert on any of this.
Yeah.
It's just
I was just
my
wondering
general
what your
sense,
theory was. Yeah.
Plus, somehow knowing Leonard Cohen was it's just on a very just down to earth sort of level. I watched what he was involved with that I didn't always understand it, but it would lodge in my memory, things he said, people that came, things that he seemed to be afraid of, different, that never made sense, and then it all makes sense when you realize, he was a CIA agent and he was taking orders. And he was being told what to do.
Did Jim Morrison ever fall into any of this?
I know someone who knew Jim Morrison who wrote a book about him. So I never heard Leonard talk about Jim Morrison, but I wouldn't be surprised, if Leonard might have known how Jim Morrison died too. I think Leonard knew how Hendrix died, and Janis Joplin, and John Lennon. I think that Leonard was involved at some level of these assassinations. I'm not saying how, but I think he was in on them.
You think Leonard Cohen was involved with with John Lennon's death?
Absolutely.
Could you tell us?
Not necessarily. It's maybe one of those things you would snip out later, but I don't know if it matters anymore. What I say. Yeah, I witnessed some things that lead me to believe that Leonard was on the team. That may or may not have actually killed John Lennon, because I was not fully convinced that they actually killed Lennon. There's more. There's been more. But I think they thought they killed John Lennon.
Do you think that John Lennon was killed because they didn't have control over him?
I think he was, yes. I think he was sort of on the other side. I think he was, if you say there was a right and a left faction in the music business, and it was the time of Ronald Reagan coming in, and Reagan was in and Lennon was out, the same week, basically, almost.
Yeah.
And so I think there was absolutely, Leonard was in the right-wing faction that would have did hate John Lennon. I know he did. And Lennon would make anti-Semitic statements sometimes, that would be one of the problems. And the other thing was he was definitely on the left. And, hoping to start a peace movement. He was working together with Mick Jagger on that, I've heard, in New York, just before he was killed. They were going to restart the 60s in 1980, as a global peace movement. And Lennon was, going to be the leader along with Yoko Ono and all that, and they'd be the symbolic leaders of it. But Ronald Reagan had other ideas, like he wanted Star Wars and a deal with Israel and all the rest of it. He was really working for the Israelis. And so Cohen was very much a Zionist and right-wing Zionist, and friend of Menachem Begin and those people. And so, a personal friend of Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon. If you remember them, they were the military and president of India, prime minister of Israel, and head of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. Those were Leonard's friends. So Leonard went to New York, and he was in New York the week John Lennon was shot, but he kept it a secret for years.
Huh? I wonder what he was doing.
He was 1 kilometer. He was a mile away across the park, in another hotel when Lennon was shot, and he was there the whole week. And I just happened to. Anyway, I happened to be a person, maybe the only person that was aware that he lied about it, that he had an alibi, that he stayed on this Greek island the whole time, and then he went to America. But I was a witness to the lie and the alibi, and unwitting. I was an unwitting witness to that, because I saw him leave the island in Greece on December 5th or something, 6th, the night that before he left. I saw him, and I saw him come back on December 14th. Lennon was killed on December 8th, and Leonard arrived back on Hydra on December 14th. First thing I said to him was, "Boy, it's terrible about John Lennon." And he just gave me this cold stare. And he said, "I never liked the Beatles." And for years, I never realized he'd really been gone. I thought he'd gone on a little trip somewhere else, but I never realized that during that space of time, there's proof. There's a hotel record. It's in his biographies that he was in New York that week. But he never said, "Well, I've just come back from New York, and John Lennon was shot while I was there," which is what would normally have happened.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying? He was gone during that, but I was in my room. It was raining. I don't know. I just wasn't aware that he'd been away all those 10 days. Only later did I realize. I saw him just before he left, and I saw him coming back, and then he was way away. And where was he? Well, I thought he'd gone maybe to Athens or Paris, just something, But no, he'd been in New York the whole time, and he never said I was in New York when John Lennon was shot. Well, who doesn't? Who would have been in Dallas? And come back to New York and not said to his friends, "I was just in Dallas and Kennedy was shot," Like, he would have told somebody, but he never told anybody, as far as I know. And I
He was
knew.
in Dallas when Kennedy was shot too.
No, well, he may actually even have been there. It's possible, it actually is possible for Leonard's timeline, which I studied quite carefully at one point. His whereabouts are unknown during the week that Kennedy was shot also. But I don't know anything about that. That was 1963. But I do know that in 1980, in December of 1980, he was in Manhattan for 10 days during that week.
All right.
So,
Well, that was interesting. What are you working? Are you working on any books now, or are you doing anything now?
Well, yeah, I'm trying. Actually, yes, I'm back in my childhood. I'm trying to. I don't know if I'm writing about it. I am writing, but for what purpose, I don't know. I'm writing about how I think I knew a lot of other musicians when I was at that hospital as a child, and there were some boys from England also there who were a bit younger than Leonard, and also part of this program. And I have had some recent, I'm having some flashbacks to those times.
What other musicians do you think you've been in the program with? Could you tell us?
The British invasion, I think got its start in London in the UK, but also they tended to touch base in Montreal before they took off on their tours of North America in 1965, 64. Some of the biggest bands. I think I think MK Ultra was many things, including, and not all of it maybe was murderous and horrible, but some of it was about entertainment, and that was because they wanted to program us with music, and they did in the 60s. Drugs, the whole thing that started in the 60s, the drugs, the LSD. I think the point of origin from all that was the Tavistock Institute in London, which was connected to the McGill program, the McGill University, and the psychiatrists worked in both. They knew one another, and they were, and they were, and sometimes worked together. And MK Ultra, all of it, I think also was involved in musical programming. In fact, I know for sure that the military was buying up recording studios and so on because they wanted to use them for mind control in London.
Well, that's why I asked you about Jim Morrison. His father was a Navy admiral, I think, or
yes,
or something like that.
And he was at the Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah,
wasn't it? And Jim Morrison, yes, I read about Morrison. And Dave McGowan, you've read David McGowan, the Laurel Canyon. It's definitely somebody you should look up. Okay. He wrote several books, but one of them was called The Hippies and the, Laurel Canyon and the Hippie Generation. You can get it online. And he talks about all the rock stars of the Laurel Canyon days having been Air Force, many of them, or Navy brats, and basically put into their careers through their connections, the military connection.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff, isn't it?
You never, once you see it, you can't unsee it. You know?
That's always the truth. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the truth. And that's with a lot of things going on today. Do you think it's gonna? Where do you think this is gonna take humanity? Do you think humanity will be able to get past this? The control.
If people know about it, that's what I think. What saves people is knowledge or consciousness, awareness. I think when you're for most of my life, I had no idea I was in this thing, and that I think I probably did things that I have no memory of. I don't know. I can't really say. I suspect I was accessed sometimes and used, but I can't prove any of that. I have no proof of it. Just a few little hints, And so when you're in that state, they can use you. When when you can start waking up to it just by asking questions. I don't think it's really rocket science to break the programming. I think it's just done through conversations like we're having, reading, going online, finding out about it, opening your mind to it, that it's a possibility. And I think that frees people. Once they can talk about it and think about it, then they're not slaves anymore. But we're really being encouraged to spend our lives in a drug kind of trance of entertainment, zombie-like consumerism.
Yeah, go to work, go home, watch our programs on TV, and then do it all again tomorrow, right?
It really seems like that's how people live. They've got to break those habits.
It's not the way we're supposed to be living.
I know.
I don't think so.
No.
All right, Ann Diamond, do you want to tell everyone where they can find you?
Well, I have a website. It's easy to remember. It's ANNDIAMOND.ca, AnnDiamond.ca. That's one place to start. And I guess I have a website that is a little harder to access. I mean, harder to give you it's called Mother of Darkness. So if you were to Google Ann Diamond, ANNDIAMOND, Mother of Darkness, you'd probably end up at my blog. That's one of my blogs, where a lot of this information can be found.
Yeah, there's a blog on Steam It too, right?
I don't know that. For me? Not that I know of. I better go check that.
Okay.
Have you seen something on Steam? I've seen links sometimes, or I've come across articles, based on...
It might just be an article that somebody wrote about you, I guess. I'm looking at it here. But I will find your blog, and I'll put the link in the description box below, along with your website link, okay?
Please do. I'd be really happy if you did that.
That way everybody can find it. So just look in the description down below, and you'll see the link. It'll be right there.
Yes, good. And I'm giving away, by the way, if they do go to my blog, it should be not too hard for them to see in the corner that I'm giving away copies of the ebook of, I've got 2 books. My Cold War was the first thing I wrote about this, and then I wrote a kind of a second version of it called A Certain Girl. And also I have a book on Leonard Cohen, also there, not for free though. Maybe I should make it, well, I don't think I will. But anyway, and it's called The Man Next Door. So all those things, if you go to my blog, I think you can find those links.
All right, yeah. And I'll definitely have the links down below. Ann Diamond, thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us today. I hope that you get the answers you're looking for and can put a lot of your bad experiences behind you as you go through life.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope the same for everybody. And Happy New Year. Let's try to get through this one.
Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. And we'll be right back. We'll be right back on Conflict Radio right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. That was Ann Diamond. Remember, her links are listed down below. You check out her links. She's offering free copies of some of her books, ebooks anyway, so be sure to check that out. Remember, you can always find us online. Just go to www.conflictradio.net. You can find us on all of your normal podcast catchers, such as Apple iTunes, Spreaker, and iHeart Podcasts. That's going to do it for us. That was a fascinating show. I'm sure that there's a lot to talk about in regards to MK Ultra and other programs like it. So, until next time, batten down the hatches and be safe.